Hello everyone and welcome back. I hope you had a good lunch and that you enjoyed the keynote. Now we will hear Dougald Hine. Please welcome Dougald.
Thank you. Right, we succeeded in wrestling with PowerPoint to get this to work. Hello everyone.
Hello.
We're in the dystopia stream, aren't we? So I guess the connection to that really is that I want to talk about some of the dystopian aspects of life as we know it that we're so used to we don't even notice. And it's going to involve a kind of big story about human history and potentially trying to rearrange some of our assumptions about that big story. But I thought I'd start with a smaller timeline. This is a little timeline of me, for those of you who I haven't crossed paths with before. Up at the top, 3 organisations that I was partially or wholly responsible for founding within a pretty busy period when I was living in London. A web startup called School of Everything, inspired by the ideas of Ivan Illich and Deschooling Society. An agency called Space Makers. A project called Dark Mountain, which has then we've gone on to publish a manifesto and a sort of series of books that you see across the bottom. So really, this is kind of a shift from being a sort of startup guy to doing more writing and publishing, and then a few of the organisations and projects that I've been associated with that seemed relevant, starting off from back before I moved to London when I was living in Sheffield, hanging out at the Access Space Media Lab there, through to this Scarcity and Creativity in the Built Environment project with the University of Westminster, which I've been a thinker out of residence attached to over the last couple of years. I ended up being slightly more out of residence than they anticipated when they asked me to join the project, because about 6 months into it, I moved from London to Stockholm, and it's disappeared off the screen, but actually 6 weeks ago, we moved from Stockholm to Västerås. So I am slowly arriving in Sweden. Right, here's the bigger timeline. I think this is too loud, actually. Are you turning it down a bit, Eric? Thank you. Great. This is a sort of, in some ways, a fairly uncontroversial story, or fairly kind of typical story of human history, but sort of extended in the direction of post-scarcity. You have from the mists of time up to the 18th and 19th century and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Life is a battle against material scarcity, subsistence, farming, and then industrialization comes along and begins to subdue material scarcity, and we no longer have to spend all of our time planting and digging up turnips. And then you get to the sort of second half of the 20th century, and we're into the information society, and that time that has been freed up because we're not spending all of our time planting and digging turnips allows us to spend more of our time on other things, and things like information become increasingly important parts of our economic lives. And so we have this phenomenon of non-scarce resources in contrast to the scarce resources which have been our preoccupation. And then this trajectory is continuing to move beyond information out up to the cornucopia device up at the top right there that allows you to print your breakfast. And this is, it sort of extends to 2045. If you Google Singularity 2045, you'll get a really nice example of the full-blown religious version of the kind of Kurzweil future that Per was talking about before lunch. But we have this kind of bad fairy down in the bottom, which is at the same time we have, at the same time as we're kind of dreaming of moving into a post-scarcity world, even in terms of material things, we also have the sort of warning light flashing on the dashboard of the environmental crisis and resource scarcity. And in case you haven't picked up already, I'm going to question some of that story. But I think that in a lot of ways this does frame the kind of the contemporary imagination, particularly the imagination of the kind of people who come to things like this, or the kind of people who we hang out with or interact with, and that leads us to certain scenarios. And I just sort of picked out 3 scenarios, really from stuff that has crossed my consciousness over the last few weeks, that, in a sense, map out the possible futures that we think of when we're operating with this story of history. So the first one is the kind of post-scarcity utopia. The quote is from, when I moved it over from the Mac to the PC, all of the text has gone out of the boxes, so let's hope that doesn't get too much weirder. This is Kevin Carson, a couple of months ago, I think he wrote this blog post. I think Kevin is one of the more interesting and thoughtful advocates of the possibilities of post-scarcity, partly because his story is not a story of we're going to magically avoid collapse and crisis and so on in this century, but it's actually going to turn out to be okay because of ephemeralization, because of these technologies. We're going to be able to navigate it. So we are going to end up living in peasant villages with a Star Trek molecular replicator in each cottage in the shadows of the decaying aqueducts of the old big infrastructure that we can no longer support. And there's been a really interesting sort of set of blog posts. A guy called John Michael Greer, who writes the Archdruid Report, who is actually the Archdruid of the ancient order of Druids in America, established 1912. And he's a really interesting sort of peak oil blogger, and he kind of picked Kevin up on this in quite a heavy way, and then there's been various other posts going on around it. But I think this is the kind of the post-scarcity utopia in which the top bit of the 2 bits on the right-hand side of the previous diagram ends up sort of trumping the bottom bit and allows us to find our way through that. On the other side, this is a scenario that Jay, who was meant to be here this weekend but couldn't make it for family reasons, has been writing about. So I don't know if you're familiar with sort of austerity, Åtstramningspolitik på svenska. Austerity policies of the kinds that we've seen in Europe in the last 5 years. So Jay's thing is, when a politics that doesn't try to pretend that climate change isn't happening finally arrives, if we think that austerity was brutal, asperity, which is the term that he's given for this, he says if austerity politicians, when they came in, tried to change the fabric of British society in 4 years, asperity politics, when it finally arrives, whether it's in 10 years or 20 years' time, they'll try and do it in 4 months. So this is the scenario that's at the other kind of end, where basically the stuff that was on the bottom of the timeline trumps the stuff that we're all excited about that might lead to the post-scarcity future, and we're just in a really horrible eco-fascist nightmare. And then, I think the other sort of scenario is some kind of dirty mashup of the 2, like Accelerando, where you get the kind of most of Kurzweil's stuff comes true, and it just happens that we sort of turn the planet into fuel. as part of the process, but that's just a kind of collateral damage on the way to the future. So I guess what I want to do then is to step back and to ask, what have these scenarios got in common, and what does that tell us about where we are, the kind of historical moment that we're in? And I think the first thing is that all three scenarios are marginal. If you just go out on the street in Gothenburg today and talk to people about it, this is not stuff that relates to their lives particularly. It's not stuff that they will necessarily engage with. Not because there is a strong mainstream vision of what the future looks like, but because the future has kind of disappeared. It's no longer there as a source of optimism in the way that it was, even under the shadow of mutually assured destruction in the 50s and 60s. Even after 2 world wars, even after Auschwitz, even after Hiroshima, even with the superpowers pointing unfathomable numbers of nuclear weapons at each other, it was still possible in the 50s and 60s to have this kind of relationship to the future as something that people could have confidence in, and it isn't now. And this is actually the stuff that I'm really interested in and writing about at the moment, and it's part of the background to this talk. And there's a quote that goes around that's variously attributed to either Frederick Jameson or Slavoj Žižek. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So there's a sense in which we're trapped in this present that we can't imagine our way beyond. It's worse than that. We can't imagine it continuing, because if we look at the evidence, we know that if something is unsustainable, sooner or later it's not going to be sustained. And we know that somehow we are heading for disaster, and at the same time, we cannot convince ourselves and each other of the possibility of some other grand vision of how things could be in the same way that was possible 50 years ago. And there's the kind of default response to that in contemporary culture is a sort of a resignation, living in a state of constant distraction, just trying not to think about the future. And obviously that's not good enough, and so there is another kind of attitude which I think of as retrofuturism. This is an early prototype for the Hyperloop from 1974. The retrofuturism, the attempt to resuscitate the future-oriented society, the society that could have confidence in the future. You see this whenever someone quotes that speech from 1962 of J.F. Kennedy. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win, and the others too. What it doesn't say is we choose to go there to prove to the Soviets that we're back ahead of them in their race. But in some sense, it was possible in the 60s to make grand speeches like that and for people to invest hope and faith in them. And if you do it now, it doesn't work. And so the retrofuturist move of trying to reboot the future, trying to resurrect the heroic future that existed for a number of generations in modernity, it's admirable in the sense that it's an attempt to do something about the depth of the mess we're in, rather than simply resign ourselves to it and try not to think about it. But I think it's doomed as well, because it won't fly now. But I don't think that that's as pessimistic a statement as it might sound like, because I don't think it's necessarily the role of the future to be the place where we, the whole source of our ability to have hope, to have a sense of political and social possibility. And partly because even when it did work, there were problems with looking to the future in that way, because the future is a screen onto which we project our assumptions. The one thing the future can't do is to help us notice the things that we take for granted at the particular place and time in which we happen to be living. By comparison, the past is a mirror. And this is a phrase that I get from Ivan Illich, a book of his called In the Mirror of the Past. And his point was that by looking carefully at the past and letting our eyes adjust and noticing the strangeness of the things that people were taking for granted in other times and places, we begin to recognize how strange we would look to them and how strange some of the things that we think are normal and take for granted are. And I think one of the problems of the future-oriented society whose death we're now living through, one of the problems of it was that the kind of narrative of historical progress on which it was structured led to an ignoring of, a downplaying of the past. The past came to be seen as a junkyard full of abandoned prototypes for the way we live now. The way people lived in the past was a crap version of the present. And I'm not arguing that instead we should romanticize the past and talk about some golden age. I'm just arguing that the past was something other than that. Rather than a kind of trash heap of abandoned prototypes, it's more like a library full of different ways that people have attempted to answer the questions of how do we make life work. And without being mistaken for expressing any kind of nostalgic desire to go back to some previous point in history, I think there might be things in that library that could be very helpful for us in shifting our understanding of how we live now and in discovering a sense of possibility that doesn't rely on the kind of grand narratives about the future that don't seem to work anymore. So it's in that context that I'm wanting to talk about scarcity and the history of scarcity today, and to bring this round to some suggestions about a new politics of scarcity. Really, the simple version of this is the problem with post-scarcity is not that it's utopian, it's that it's not radical enough. It accepts the rule of universal scarcity as a good description of history up to this point. And that description is one of the founding premises of economics. The classic statement of it from a lecture given by Lionel Robbins in 1932 at the London School of Economics is to define economics as the science which studies human behaviour as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. And you get some form of that in the first pages of any economics textbook. Economics defines itself as the study of how we make decisions in environments of scarcity, and then proceeds to study the whole of human activity on the assumption that it is characterized by constant universal scarcity. And part of what I'm going to be trying to say is that actually, throughout most of human history, in most times and places, that's not a good description of how things have been. There have been seasons of scarcity, if you like, but the constant ubiquitous sense of scarcity is actually a peculiar phenomenon of the kinds of modern society that economics came into being within and exists to describe. And one of the constant ambiguities with economics is to what extent is it trying to describe a historically specific state of affairs, and to what extent is it discovering underlying scientific rules about human activity that were there all along, but only got noticed once we developed this modern science of economics. And so I've been using this word scarcity, and we were talking over lunch about Swedish translations for this, and I think the correct translation for it is knapphet, and one of the reasons for emphasizing that is to distinguish it from shortage or brist. So shortage is part of the mix of human experience in all times and places. Scarcity is something more specific, and hopefully as we go on we might get a bit more of a picture of why I think that distinction is important. But to do that, I want to take up Illich's invitation to look into the mirror of the past. In 1330, in Florence, one of the places where an early version of something that looks like capitalism was beginning to evolve, a rich cloth merchant died and left his wealth to be distributed amongst the destitute. Not just the poor, but the people who've fallen through the bottom of society. And we know who was considered to fall into that category, because that money was divided up by the Guild of Or Saint-Michelet. It was divided between 5 categories of people: the widows, the orphans, the people who had recently suffered an act of God, in other words, an injury of some kind that prevented them from normal activity, the wage workers, and the people who had to pay rent in order to have somewhere to sleep. In medieval society, to be dependent on selling your labour for money as the primary means by which you could stay alive, or to have to pay rent in order to have somewhere to sleep, was to have fallen through the bottom of society. And this is part of how we begin complicating that historical narrative that we began with, is by noticing how we've got used to things which would have been considered to be, in abject destitution, and they have become normal along the way.
Even desirable.
Well, yes. I mean, we've been through this long journey into modernity, and none of this is to dispute, none of this is to kind of argue for, as I say, none of this is to argue for somehow all getting in a time machine and going back to the 14th century and living there, not only because there are things we would not gladly choose to leave behind about the way that we live now, but also because we haven't got a time machine, or the one we've got has only one gear and goes at a speed of 24 hours a day, and we travel in it looking out of the back window. So how did we get from a world in which to be a wage worker or to have to pay rent was considered to be real misery and indignity to a world where that's totally normal? Well, it's part of the story of the Industrial Revolution. It's the other side of the story that was depicted in that first slide. And it's not that one side is not true. It's just that what we're looking at is a really complex, ambiguous historical phenomenon rather than a simple march of progress. So the story of the Industrial Revolution is a story of massive resistance by ordinary people. And this is something we don't really learn about often in school, in history. And even more importantly, there were 2 phases to that resistance. The first phase of it was a fight, a war. And on the part of ordinary people, it was a war to try and defend a way of life. It's the same phrase in Swedish, ett sätt att leva. A way of life, a whole way of being, which was under massive threat. And it was only when that phase of resistance was defeated, it was only when that war was lost, that the beginnings of the labour movement as we know it, and the second phase of resistance to industrial capitalism began in the 19th century. So all of the achievements of social democracy were the achievements of the defeated in that initial war, then fighting to try and get to better terms with the people who had defeated them and destroyed the possibility of the way of living which they had been fighting for. What was that way of living? It was a way of living which was centred on the household. It was a way of living which work was hard, life was hard, but work was also varied. People were not wholly exposed to the market. They were able to produce many of their own needs on a local scale, not least through access to the commons. And just as an illustration of this point about emphasising this really was a war. In 1811, 1812, at the height of the Luddite uprising, there were 12,000 troops deployed by the British government in 4 counties of England to try and suppress, and it took them 6 months to suppress this rebellion. 12,000 troops, that was more than were fighting in Spain that year in the Napoleonic Wars for Britain. That's how big the fight by ordinary people to try and defend this way of living in which people were not wholly at the mercy of the market, in which people were not wholly dependent on wage labour. That's how big a fight it was. See, it's not necessary to romanticize, it would be a mistake to romanticize the way of living of pre-industrial society, but it's not necessary to romanticize it in order to make this point. Just the evidence of how strongly people were prepared to fight in itself is the evidence that we need in order to make this point. And at the heart of that war was the destruction of the commons. The commons in the historical sense, the equivalent of the Allmänningen in rural Sweden, the land which is not owned by individuals but has a complex set of agreements about usage. And there's lots of stuff that can be said about commons. I'm not going to try and cover it all here. There's a passage from one of Illich's texts, Silence is a Commons, where he says, people called commons that part of the environment which lay beyond their own thresholds and outside of their own possessions, to which, however, they had recognised claims of usage, not to produce commodities, but to provide for the subsistence of their households. And that last bit is incredibly important, because a lot of what's said about commons today is said in terms of commons as pools of resources. And actually, there's a real problem with that. And Peter Linnebau, who's one of the historians of the commons, says to speak of the commons as if it were a natural resource is misleading at best and dangerous at worst. The commons is an activity, and if anything, it expresses relationships in society that are inseparable from relations to nature. It might be better to keep the word as a verb, an activity, commoning, rather than as a noun, a substantive. But the key thing here for me is the reason why it's misleading to talk about the commons as a resource is because when you look at something as a resource, you're seeing it as a raw material for a commodity. In other words, you have already mentally categorized it into a system of exchange. And the key fact about the historical commons that were stolen by a massive political theft over a relatively short period. Most of it took place in about 80 years between the mid-18th and early 19th century in England and Wales. The key fact about it was they were not the commons that's imagined in Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons article. They were something which you had access to for usage, but not for exchange. And this is really simple. This is really common sense. If any of you stayed in a hotel in Gothenburg last night and, like we did, had breakfast this morning and there's a sort of smorgasbord, you can take as much as you want. But what you can't do is set up a stall on the street and keep going back to the smorgasbord and filling up a plate and take it out on the street and sell it. It's that simple, the difference between the right of usage and the prohibition on the extraction of it as a resource to turn into a commodity to sell. And part of the reason why scarcity is pervasive in modern societies, as a background experience, is because once you remove all of the rules which distinguish between usage and exchange, and everything is fair game if you can get hold of it for exchange, then, if instead of us just all going and having breakfast at the smorgasbord, if we were all setting up little businesses out front, we would soon clear out the hotel's food supply. And that's basically the kind of world that we ended up with as a result of what happened in this period. And sure, we got all sorts of other stuff from it, which is not, most of it is not going away. Many of it, much of it is good. But this is the kind of the shadow side of it. That slide that image that I used in the original slide of the view of history, which you might categorize with this from the mists of time. People have lived in hunger. This is actually from the 1870s in India. And this book by Mike Davis is absolutely extraordinary. It's a study of the way in which the incorporation of India, China and Brazil into the first global commodity market that was created by the British in the 19th century, the way in which that created new kinds and new scales of famine. And there were between 30 and 60 million deaths of hunger between 1870 and 1914 in these parts of the world which had been incorporated into the Manchester Corn Exchange, effectively. In the 70 years previously, it's about a tenth of that number that we can document. And part of it is that what you had was people starving to death in places where the food, the crops hadn't failed, because the price of corn was such and the availability of wage labour was such. In the Irish famine of the 1840s, the potato famine, we all learn about it, we all know about how the potato crop failed because of the blight. Ireland was a net food exporter throughout the famine. So, but worse than this, actually one thing that I'm only just beginning to realise as I explore this stuff further is how far, on a ground level, colonialism from Britain was powered not least by people fleeing the collapse of subsistence in the UK. There's an Australian guy, Jim Barrett, who is teaching at Umeo, who I've been talking to about this, and his ancestors were in the very earliest generation of people who went from the British Isles to Australia, and particularly on the Scottish side of his family, they were people who had had their land stolen from them, and they went to Australia because they could try and get back the kind of life where they could actually support themselves off the land rather than have to go and live in the city and work in a factory that had been taken from them in their own country. And unfortunately, it was done on a platform of genocide. And at the beginning of the First World War, the average Australian soldier was 4 inches taller than the average British soldier. And that's just one indicator of the reality of this and the lived experience of people. So, I've begun to bring into question the model of history with which we started, and key to the way that I'm trying to question it is this idea of subsistence. Again, this is one that we were struggling a bit to find the Swedish translation for. On the one hand, you have självförsörjning, which is kind of closer to self-sufficiency in English. But there's another word, husbehov, which I quite like as well. So subsistence, the first thing to say about it as a word is to look at how it's been used and how it's changed. The English word to subsist comes from a Latin word meaning to stand firm. It suggests strength. It's quite similar to Swadeshi in Gandhi's political vocabulary. Yet, in the lexicon of economics, subsistence is treated as abject poverty. It's the lowest level of existence. Subsistence farming is the poorest of the poor, from which economic development is offering liberation. And the point at which subsistence went from connoting strength to connoting weakness is precisely the point when the means of subsistence have been stolen from people, forcing them into the situation of the normalisation of wage labour. Another really important confusion to name. Subsistence is not the American individualist ideal of self-sufficiency, of being on your homestead, totally autonomous, totally independent from everybody. All actual subsistence societies that we know about today and in history are highly social. It's not about a sort of atomized cutting off from society. It's about being connected by other means than through money. And historically, money has been a pretty widespread phenomenon in history, but it hasn't been dominant in so many areas of our lives in the way that it became after the war against subsistence. And in a sense, David Graeber's book on debt has lots of great stuff on this, that money is how you deal with enemies, with soldiers, with strangers. And precision is something you only need with enemies. The point at which you get, like the point in a relationship where you start counting things, but do you remember this time when you did that? That's the point when a relationship is really in trouble, like the friendship, the relationship has been exhausted. In a context of knowing each other, of living alongside each other, in a context of friendship, you don't need precise calibration, and you have a general sense of who owes who a favour, but you don't have to account for it with precision. One of the consequences of living in highly monetised societies is that we become strangers to each other. And we live in societies that have an epidemic of loneliness. So there was a war against subsistence, and the world that we inherited, the world we grew up taking for granted in countries like Sweden or England, is a world that was built on the ruins of a world of subsistence. And social democracy achieved great things, but it was always, to some extent, vulnerable to Orwell's line about the hypocrisy of all European socialists is that they want a lifestyle for everyone, which is only made possible by the unbearable suffering of millions of Asiatic coolies, I think is his expression. It's in Orwell's essay on Kipling. Anyway, we see it unravelling around us now, which is part of why revisiting this history becomes meaningful. But it's also important to say that this is not just historical. The war against subsistence is an ongoing war. It's continuing elsewhere right now, often brutally. Just one example, Arundhati Roy's book, Broken Republic, from a couple of years ago, which is a series of essays based on time that she's spent in the areas of India where the Maoist insurgency is going on. The figures are extraordinary for India. I read one estimate which suggested that 50% of the territory of India is not under the control of the Indian government. I don't know whether that's true or not, but there is a huge kind of unreported war going on, and it's not just in India, it's in large parts of Latin America as well, in different forms. And part of what comes through in Roy's book is the two steps by which the people in these tribal areas of India have been, by which the theft of land has taken place. And it's very clear, this is theft of land where you have deep corruption connecting government officials to multinational corporations that want this land in order to mine it. And what happens first is people are told, we're going to develop you. We're going to take you out of your subsistence poverty, and we're going to move you to a city and build you houses and schools and incorporate you into the modern world. And then, when people say no and they resist it, they become terrorists and the army is sent in and they are killed. And the only people who are sticking up for them are the Maoists. And I think Roy is a little bit kind of naive at times about the Maoists. But these stories, this also in the latest issue, the latest Dark Mountain book that we've produced, there's an extraordinary set of dispatches from Bastar, another of the tribal regions of India. But it's not just all kind of, it's not all determined. Again, back to Pear's talk, there are strong forces pushing against, perpetrating the war against subsistence, but that doesn't mean there's a deterministic historical force which makes it inevitable that subsistence is eliminated. This statistic blew my mind when I was introduced to it last year by Gustavo Esteva, a Mexican activist and intellectual. Only 30% of the world's food is produced within the agro-industrial food chain. 50% of the food in the world is still grown by peasants who are living with at least 1 foot in the subsistence world. And that just was completely outside of my perception. And that report, which was produced at the time of the Copenhagen Climate Summit, has quite a lot of detail behind those numbers. La Via Campesina, the peasant political movement, the way of the peasant, can make a good claim to being the largest organisation in the world in terms of the number of people it's representing. And the battles it's engaged in are battles not least against, over intellectual property, over patented seeds. So there is a lot of convergence between the ongoing issues around the war of subsistence and the issues that we're all engaged with and talking about at a conference like this. And part of what I want to suggest is the possibility that there is actually a political convergence here, and that a really powerful, radical politics of scarcity that is not simply accepting scarcity as the historical norm and then dreaming of post-scarcity, but is actually challenging the root concepts of scarcity, might be a very exciting real politics of the 21st century. And in terms of looking at where there are little bridges between our world and the world that I've mostly been talking about, there's a great short story that Vinay Gupta, who was also supposed to be here but never turns up to things that he's invited to, he wrote a piece which was published on World Changing 6 or 7 years ago called The Unplugged, which is set in about 2030 in an America where about 12% of the population have just opted off-grid into a new subsistence culture, which is sort of high-tech, appropriate technology subsistence world. And you see the hexayerts at Burning Man there. The thing about Vinay is that he's not just writing about this stuff, he's trying to build the tools and share knowledge about the tools. And open source ecology. Actually, Vinay made the first videos of the open source technology project very early on that helped to start to spread the word about it. But I think it would be really interesting to see, I think there could be more connection between things like the Global Village Construction Set and the Open Source Ecology Project and the majority of people in the world today who still have at least one foot in a village, and often a village where subsistence is still a living reality. Like, there are still bridges to be built here. But there are people who are building those bridges as well, and someone like Shannon Hayes, the Radical Homemakers book that she wrote, Reclaiming Domesticity from a Consumer Culture. Another key part of this story of the war against subsistence, something really important that happened within it, and this is something that I write about in the book that I've just published, The Crossing of Two Lines, is the schism of home from work. And the subsistence world is a world where home is the centre from which you go out and to which you come back, and it's a world in which you're able to make sense of the world from that perspective. And a big part of what happens with this shift that I've been talking about is this radical separation out of work as something that goes on elsewhere in the workplace. And the home, which is no longer a living centre of life, becomes a dormitory for the worker and a place where new kinds of work are ascribed to women. And a lot of the kind of... It's interesting, if you go back into the history of this, a lot of the people who were fighting hardest, among the ordinary people who were fighting against this war against subsistence, were women. There are extraordinary stories from the beginning of the 19th century about ordinary women in villages and towns in England who were organising to fight for the vernacular way of life that was being destroyed by the kinds of machines that the Luddites took up, weapons to go and smash. Luddites were not anti-technology. I hope you all know that. They were anti-technology that was destructive of commonality. And you have people like Claudio Oliver in Brazil doing really interesting examples of urban farming in practice. This guy is Deke Jackson. He is the leader of the Landless Peasant Party in the UK. As far as I know, he's also the only member of the Landless Peasant Party in the UK. He's a bit crazy. The guy standing in front of him is Gordon Brown, our former Prime Minister. And Deke stood for the Landless Peasant Party in Brown's constituency at the last general election. And I'm not arguing that we should all go and join Deke and follow him, because I think he might be a bit crazy, although he did come to our first Dark Mountain Festival and gave a really interesting talk. But I think that it might be really helpful if, as well as identifying as pirates, we were also identifying as landless peasants, because we are. Understanding ourselves as landless peasants, noticing that that's actually the background of our condition. And among other things, it begins to make sense of the paradox that we live in this materially intensive society, and yet with a pervasive sense of scarcity and precariousness, a lot of which is the consequence of the kind of new scarcity that happens when everyone can go to the smorgasbord and take the food and sell it on a stall outside. When the boundaries between use and exchange are dissolved by force in the way that happened historically. So fundamentally, I'm saying let's not get stuck in the assumption that universal scarcity is a good description of how things always were. I'm not saying let's go back to the 14th century or the 17th century or anything. I'm saying let's look into the mirror of the past, let's visit the library, let's also build connections with people around the world today who are still engaged in the fight for the right to the means of subsistence. And let's recognise that for many of the things that we want to achieve in countries like ours, particularly as things continue to unravel and we continue to see young people growing up poorer than their parents in most of the Western world, actually reactivating the politics of subsistence, saying, no, the war is not over, and joining up forces between the pirates and the landless peasants. I think that might be the point where we can begin to make a really interesting, powerful politics for the kind of times in which we find ourselves.
Say that we don't have time for any questions, but I'm sure you'll find Dougald in the corridor or speeches. So.
Near a source of beer.
Yeah.